Our study this morning, and for me, one of my favorites, I've been sharing that with you. It's also a great communion Sunday study as well. The first 11 verses, John chapter 12. Would you read along with me, please? 6 days before the Passover, let me rephrase that. 6 days before Jesus becomes the Passover lamb, Jesus arrived at Bethany where Lazarus lived, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. Here a dinner was given in Jesus' honor. Martha served while Lazarus was among those reclining at the table with him. Then Mary took about a pint of pure nard, an expensive perfume. She poured it on Jesus' feet and wiped his feet with her hair. And the house, I want you to try to imagine this, and the house was filled with the fragrance of her perfume. But one of his disciples, Judas Iscariot, who was later to betray him, objected. Why wasn't this perfume sold and the money given to the poor? It was worth a year's wages. He did not say this because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. As keeper of the money bag, he used to help himself to what was put into it. Leave her alone, Jesus replied. It was intended that she should save this perfume for the day of my burial. You will always have the poor among you, but you will not always have me. Meanwhile, a large crowd of Jews found out that Jesus was there and came not only because of him, but also to see Lazarus, whom he had raised from the dead. So the chief priests made plans to kill Lazarus as well. For on account of him, many of the Jews were going over to Jesus and putting their faith in him. Father, we thank you for the time of song. But today, Lord, I think more than perhaps any other study in this gospel, we want to remember that our singing is not worship. Our singing is not a sacrifice. Our singing these love songs is an honor and a privilege because you loved us so much that you sent your Son to be that sacrifice, that righteous sacrifice for us. Let us today, Lord, understand that worship comes from our lives. Not what we say, but what we do, who we are. And I thank you for the privilege of being able to stand on the stage and look out during that last song and look at the hearts of the people with hands raised, knowing the manner of their lives. Lord, I know that it's true worship. Today, teach us, Lord, to be worshipers in spirit and in truth on this Communion Sunday. Help us to love you more than ever before. And as I always pray, Lord, in this service and the two that will follow, if there's even one on this Communion Sunday who isn't born again, let him or her, let them come to know the one who died for their sins. What an honor and a privilege it is to come to your table today, Lord. May we bring with us to the communion table today the aroma of true and pure and holy worship for your glory. We love you, Jesus. Amen. Worship, and we're going to show a picture on the screen. Does that look like worship? That's newborn Alana York. And when they were sending pictures and Paula got them, she said, oh, look, she's worshiping, right? That's what worship looks like. Eyes to heaven, mouth open, and you can just see the tenderness in that heart. Well, that's what I got to see. You see, for some reason in our church culture, we have developed the idea that worship is singing, that it's the music portion of our time together. But worship is our lives. Worship is who we are. Worship is what comes from us. Worship is our behavior, our actions, and not just our words. I've shared this with you before. I'm not much of a music guy. The only time I ever listen to music, and I mean literally ever, is during worship here at church. Well, once in a while I have to stumble into Hall & Oates being played out there by my pastors and staff, but maybe that's why I hate music. But worship is what you saw in the faces of the men and women who are on this stage. You know, every Sunday, one of my prayers for them is that they would stand on the stage and they would be aware of the privilege, the awesome privilege it is to lead people like me, non-music people, into the presence of God. That they would stand on the stage sort of in awe that God would use them, that he would allow them this honor and this privilege, and that they would understand how important it is to live the words that they sing. Worship can be a really, really hard thing because of the songs that you're singing, the words that you're proclaiming. If it's not true in your life, well, then it's not worship at all. And one of the things I'm most proud of here at Calvary Chapel is I know the people on this stage. Whether it's Sunday or Wednesday night or Friday night or the people that are leading worship on Mondays or Thursdays, I know those men and women. And I know their lives, and their lives are true worship. Today, we're going to talk about what real worship is. And it's not the singing. You want to do a great study on worship? Go through the Old Testament. Every time the word worship is mentioned, something dies. This morning, we're going to learn that worship is all about who we are. Not who we say we are, but about who we are and how we live our lives. Worship, we're going to find, requires courage. Worship takes some risks. And worship really, really, really smells good. You remember in our last chapter, we had the stench of death. Roll away the stone, Jesus said. Oh, Lord, by now he stinketh. He's been there 4 days. This morning is really the aroma of life. 6 days before the Passover, Jesus arrived at Bethany, where Lazarus lived, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. Here, a dinner was given in Jesus' honor. Now, Mark and Matthew's Gospels both tell us that the dinner was held in the home of a man named Simon the leper. Though he is unnamed here, we know from the other Gospels that the site of this occasion was his home, the home of Simon the leper. Now, we don't know anything about this man, except that he used to be a leper. He's not a leper anymore. Obviously, if he was, nobody would go to his house. Nobody would have anything to do with him. But obviously this was a man, a leper, who had met Jesus, had come to Jesus, and Jesus healed him. And he was so grateful that he hosted a party in Jesus' honor. That he was still known as Simon the leper just shows that some people will never let you forget who you used to be. Can you imagine writing this thing and Simon gets a copy of it? He goes, Simon the leper, come on, I'm not a leper anymore. Yeah, but that's how everybody remembers you. It'd be like somebody introducing me. Let me introduce you to my pastor. This is Ron the jerk. No. I used to be him, but I'm not him anymore. But people have short memories, and they hold on to things against you. That gives us more reason to worship Jesus because he keeps no record of wrongs. He forgets everything that was ever an offense against him. Obviously, as I said, Jesus healed this man, Simon, and out of gratitude, Simon invited Jesus and his closest friends to this dinner. That means the first really, really good smelling act of worship in our study this morning comes from the host of the party, even though he isn't mentioned by name in the gospel. A couple of things. One is out of gratitude. He opened his home and he invited all of his friends. You know, if we're really worshipers of God, we want people that we care about to know about Jesus. And so we invite them to church. We invite them to our homes. We invite them to opportunities to share what God is doing in our lives. It makes us uncomfortable at times to do those things, but worship, real worship, is being so grateful to God that he's just bursting from you. And the people in your lives, the people that you really care about, you want them to know the hope that you have. And you want them to have that same hope in their lives. Simon, because he was grateful, he invited his friends, people that he cared about, so that he could introduce them to Jesus. But there was something else in this. And I've talked a lot about worship taking risks. Simon was taking a huge risk opening his home. By now, Jesus was the most wanted man in the city. Everyone was looking for him. It was common knowledge that the religious leaders were trying to kill him. Simon took a risk. Why would he do it? Why should we take risks sharing our faith with people that we care about? Why should we take risks not wondering or worrying about what anybody else thinks? Well, for Simon, it was simple. Leprosy, as you know, is a type of sin in Scripture. And just as religious people today will try to distance themselves from sinners, it was also true that in Jesus' day, no other rabbi would come anywhere close to a leper. Lepers were forced to crowd, unclean, unclean, as they would walk down the street. So everybody could get out of the way. And if they would accidentally come into contact with one of these religious leaders, it could have cost them their lives. Simon would never forget that day when Jesus walked to him. Simon probably yelling, unclean, to be safe. Unclean, get out of my way. And they would see this rabbi walking toward him with a group of disciples behind him, I'm sure quite a ways behind him. And Jesus would come up and he would take Simon's face in his hands. And he would smile at him and he would be able to watch as the spots in Simon's face, his hands, wherever they were, they would be cleansed. And for the first time, Simon would know that God loved him. For the first time, Simon understood what the touch of Jesus was really all about, the intimacy of the physical touch that he'd been deprived of for so long. I love thinking about Simon's face as Jesus held him, as Jesus prayed for him. I'm sure praying something like, Father, you love this man. And now heal him, I pray. And Simon's life was forever changed. Why would Simon take risks when Jesus was the most wanted person, when he himself could be in trouble? He didn't care. All he cared about was Jesus. And that's what a grateful heart is. If you are a true worshiper, if your worship smells good to the Lord, then it has to come from a grateful heart. It has to come from a grateful heart. A grateful heart also takes the cue from Simon and shares with the people that we care about. Continuing, it says Martha served. Martha is our second act of worship, good-smelling worship. And her worship always took the form of service. Martha was, I expect, a lot like me personally, in that she really couldn't do a lot. She could serve. We have people in this church, so many, who say, well, I really can't do things, but I can fix stuff, or I can do that, or I can do that. I'm willing to help here. On Wednesday nights, you should see the people that stick around and put the school back together. Sometimes it's just a few of them, but they're here and they're working, they're serving. You see, real worship sacrifices. Real worship serves. Martha was a servant. Now, while it may have seemed to her like her sister Mary had a special in with the Lord, Martha would say, all I really have to offer is what I can do with my hands. Now, we know that Martha is sort of infamous for getting upset with her sister because she was busy preparing a meal for the Lord, and she got a little flustered because Mary wasn't helping her. She asked Jesus to help. Lord, don't you care that my sister has left me to do all the work myself? Tell her to help me. That's what Martha said. Is there anyone in this room today who hasn't done a little bit of complaining when they were serving, when they felt perhaps they were being ignored or they weren't being helped by other people? You wonder, where's all the other people to help? Well, we're just like Martha. But I think we need to give the Marthas a break. Martha was serving. Jesus didn't say she'd done anything wrong. All he said was that Mary had found the better thing at that particular juncture by sitting at the Lord's feet, worshiping. And Martha could have been worshiping through her service, but because she was troubled by those other things, Martha, Martha, you're troubled by many things. Now we find her serving from a heart of worship, from a grateful heart. That's why we need to give the Marthas of the world, male and female Marthas, by the way, a break. God bless all of you Marthas. We have so many of you, and we need you. Every church of Jesus Christ needs you, and you're deeply, deeply appreciated. While it's true that on that one occasion Martha needed to be gently corrected, here's something else that we know about real worship, genuine worship, is worship accepts correction. She didn't go away grumbling. She took what the Lord said to her. Mary's found the better thing. Martha, you're troubled by many things. Martha repented. She was honest. You're right, I'm troubled. I shouldn't be worried about what Mary's doing. I'm serving you, Lord, because I love you. And the next time we see her, even after losing and then gaining her brother Lazarus again, Martha is serving all over again. In other words, she learned the lesson that Jesus wanted to learn. Real worship. Worship in spirit and in truth learns whatever the lesson is that Jesus is trying to teach you. I want to thank all of you Marthas from the depths of my heart, because your worship is beautiful and we benefit from it. And your worship smells really, really good. Worshiper number 3 is Lazarus, while Lazarus was among those reclining at the table with him. Now, Lazarus worships Jesus in fellowship. This is important because we throw out these terms, worship. Well, worship is the singing part. Fellowship is what happens, when we just kind of hang out. Lazarus, who'd been raised from the dead, was so grateful that his way of worshiping the Lord was just to be with him. I'll bet Jesus couldn't get rid of Lazarus. We'd have to wonder why Lazarus was there. He was so grateful to God, and now God was using him as well. And he just wanted to be where Jesus is. True worship spends time with Jesus. We're getting ready at the end of our service today to come to the table of communion. It's a table of koinonia, fellowship. That's what the word is. And it means spiritual oneness, spiritual connectedness to Jesus. And if we're really going to be worshipers, then we've got to be men and women who hang out with Jesus. Now, there's also more risk involved here, because we read later in this chapter that Jesus wasn't the only one the religious leaders wanted to kill. Lazarus was now on their list as well, because evidently his ministry had become so effective in converting Jews. So Lazarus, well, if they're going to chase him, they're going to chase me too. We might as well be hanging out together. That's what real worship is. Real worship is fellowship with the Lord. Paul says that we're to pray without ceasing. The only way that's possible is it means we always need to be in the presence of the Lord. It's when we hang out with the Lord that God can speak to us quietly, when he can speak to us tenderly. It's in his presence that you'll get new direction, new vision, new inspiration. And that's why fellowship is worship. It is disingenuous to come to church, raise your hands in song, and then not spend any time with the Lord the rest of the week. If you're a real worshiper, you want to be around him. You want to be near him. You want that aroma of Christ to be what other people experience whenever you enter the room. And I don't care who you are, the only way that's possible, is when you're hanging out with Jesus. Verse 3 says, then Mary. Mary is the star of our study this morning. I told you this already in previous studies, but we see Mary only 3 times in Scripture in the New Testament, and she's always seen at the feet of Jesus. The first time was in that incident with her sister Martha in Luke chapter 10. She had a sister, Martha did, called Mary, who sat at the Lord's feet listening to what he said. I want you to imagine Mary hanging on every word. Martha's busy serving, and Martha's a little worried that Mary's not helping her. But Mary has just one thing on her mind. I want to be where he is. I want to soak up everything that he has to say to me. I want to sit at his feet and worship because his words bring life. His words change. Mary is found at the feet of Jesus. The second time was in our last chapter. In verse 32, when Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Even in her grief, she found her way to the feet of Jesus. Even in her grief. You know, sometimes when things are going, well, when they're difficult, when they're painful, when our hearts are broken, some of those times are the times we feel the least like being at his feet. But those are the times when we need to be there the most. Those are the times when we need to do what we know we should do instead of what we feel like doing. And that's the very definition of worship. We bring you a sacrifice of praise. Again, it's not a sacrifice to sit here and listen to these people sing up here. That's no sacrifice. There's no sacrifice to sit next to you and see you pouring your heart out to the Lord. But when you do what you need to do, when you don't feel like doing it, that's true worship. That's when it's a sacrifice. And though her heart was broken, though undoubtedly, as we discussed in our study in chapter 11, Mary was discouraged because Jesus didn't arrive on time. She fell at his feet because she knew that's where she needed to be. The third time is now in our story. Then Mary took about a pint of pure nard, an expensive perfume. She poured it on Jesus' feet. And the Greek is strong. She poured it all out. She left nothing behind. She poured it all out on Jesus' feet. Now, you need to notice this is a fortune in terms of value. Judas will later say it's a year's worth of wages. It's a fortune for Mary. Perhaps, most likely, her dowry. I want you to get this. This is true worship. What she was doing was sacrificing her future as a married woman. A young woman who obviously, as all Jewish women wanted to be mothers, she was a young woman who wanted her own family. And yet she was willing to pour her whole future out, sitting at the feet of Jesus. She was willing to sacrifice it all. Now, if we're real worshipers in spirit and in truth, then we've got to be willing to give everything. Paul says, I'm spent and willing to be spent. Again, very strong Greek words. I'm spent. I got nothing left. But I'm willing to spend more. You see, that's what we've got to do. If we're really worshipers of God, we can't hold anything back. We've got to give him everything. It all belongs to him because it all comes from him, but we've got to be willing to give everything if our worship is genuine, if our worship is sincere. In this particular case, especially in this Jewish culture, Mary was sacrificing her future as a married woman for Jesus. But that was just the beginning of the risks that Mary was taking in her act of worship. Her worship involved a very intimate act. Letting her hair down in that religious Jewish culture, it was an unthinkable thing for a woman to do. You know what's really beautiful about that? And this is true worship. Mary only cared about what Jesus thought. She didn't care about what anybody else was saying. She didn't care about what anybody else would or how they would react. She wasn't worried about people talking badly about her. Mary cared only about what Jesus thought instead of worrying about what everybody else thought. So what did Jesus think? Well, not in this gospel, but in the other gospel accounts, we read that Jesus will rebuke Judas and the others by saying this, she has done a beautiful thing to me. Wouldn't you love for Jesus to be able to say about your worship, he has done a beautiful thing to me. They poured out everything and it's a beautiful thing to me. Now we don't think it is much of a sacrifice because, well, he gave everything for us. But please understand, in heaven, when we worship in spirit and in truth, when our worship involves pouring everything out for the Lord, in heaven, Jesus is saying, she's done a beautiful thing to me. And Mary's worship, because she cares only what Jesus thinks, is really a beautiful thing. I pray that God views your life and my life the very same way. And the reason I pray that is because of the payoff. Look at the rest of the sentence. And Mary wiped his feet with her hair, and the house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. We have a Mary in our church, little Mary. She's a grown woman now, but she's been here since she was 16, and we called her Little Mary then, and we just don't change much, so she's always been Little Mary. And she used to have this habit. I used to kind of slap her hand, She'd have this habit. She always had her hair in her hands, and she was always smelling her hair. She'd have her hair, and I said, Mary, don't smell your hair. And she, okay, I won't. But then she'd go right back to it. Now, I always ask if it's okay that I talk about people. So I said, I'm going to talk about you again. Is that okay? She goes, yes. And I said, well, I'm going to talk about you smelling your hair. And she goes, oh, I still do it. I thought I broke her of it. But you see, she smelled her hair. And the reason I bring that up is because I can't imagine that Mary didn't keep smelling her hair. Now, I don't mean this to sound funny at all. But Mary's hair, the most beautiful fragrance ever, Mary's hair smelled like Jesus' feet. The feet that would later have nails driven through them, attaching him to a cross. Mary's hair smelled like Jesus' feet. Everyone in that house would have a lasting reminder of heaven's fragrance. I'll bet Mary didn't wash her hair like forever. And I'll bet Mary would walk around after Jesus' death, smelling her hair, remembering when she poured it all out for Jesus. I am willing to bet that fragrance sustained her, perhaps better than any of the other followers of Jesus in that 3-day period of time they were waiting for Jesus to rise from the dead, when others thought their hopes had all been dashed. Mary in her sadness, Mary in her grief, would be able to take her hair, twirl in her hands, and smell Jesus' feet. Nothing could be better or more comforting. But you see, that's what true worship is. Please note that it began with her giving everything. Everything. Here's what I can tell you. If you pour out everything for the Lord and you sit at his feet, other people in your life will notice that you've got the aroma of Jesus as well. Now, if that was the end of our study, it'd be really, really great, but it's not. Verse 4 begins with the word but, and that's never a good thing. But one of his disciples, Judas Iscariot, who was later to betray him, objected. Why? Underline that word, please. Why wasn't this perfume sold and the money given to the poor? It was worth a year's wages. I went to Bible college with a friend that every time that this verse was read, he would say, yeah, poor Judas. Verse 6 says he did not say this because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. As keeper of the money bag, he used to help himself to what it was put into it. This is really sad. It's sad because the very first words that we have recorded from Judas, a very key figure in the gospel accounts, the very first word that comes from his mouth is the word why. True worshipers don't ask why. Judas's first word is why. There's always someone in the group that needs to know why. Instead of just doing whatever it is that the Lord is asking you to do, pouring it all out, there's always somebody who says, well, why do you have to do that? Why do you have to be so committed? Why do you have to be so radical? Well, we now can answer because we have to pour it all out for the Lord. If we're not giving everything, we're really not giving anything. Now, I understand how offensive that is to some. Well, I can't give everything. We have no other choice. How can we not give everything to him who gave everything first for us? We need to be careful. If we're true worshipers, we need to be men and women who strike the word why out of our vocabulary. I told you genuine worship takes risks. Well, part of that risk is walking with Jesus in obedience, regardless of whether or not you know why or where you're going. All we need to do is obey. Not only is Judas identified here as the objector, the one the most upset about this display of love and affection, but Matthew and Mark's Gospels tell us that he was successful in stirring up the other disciples as well. Isn't that sad? All it takes is one. Why? I mean, this money could have been sold. Why would the other disciples be dragged into his mess? Remember, he is the betrayer. He's the one the devil is going to enter into him. He's the one Jesus is going to dismiss from what we call the Last Supper. Why would the other disciples be dragged into his mess? Well, it's simple. Because this sounds so spiritual. It sounds so noble. It sounds so Christian, doesn't it? Well, we shouldn't waste this money. We should give it to the poor. And that sounds like such a good thing. And I mean, who can argue with giving it to the poor? It's interesting that Jesus is about to say, the poor you will always have with you, but I'm just here for a minute. I mean, we look at the poor and we think, well, why do we need big church buildings? Or why do we need to spend money on this thing or that thing? Why aren't we just helping poor people? Our job is to worship. And the only way we can worship is to be obedient to our calling. One of the things that the others should have noticed instantly is that if Jesus was permitting Mary's extravagant display of love and worship, it should have been unquestioned. If it was okay with Jesus, it's got to be okay with them. But we get so easily dragged in to those kinds of things. There's always someone in the middle of the body of Christ who's going to criticize the way Jesus directs his money to be spent. There's always someone who's going to criticize the way worship is done or the rules by which a church operates. Instead, you know what? We just need to worship ourselves. And we do that by being obedient, giving our lives. So Jesus gives really good direction to those people. Verse 7, leave her alone. I like that. It was intended that she should save this perfume for the day of my burial. You will always have the poor among you, but you will not always have me. Now, these are stunning statements because Mary, always being found at the feet of Jesus, Mary pouring it all out, Mary had more spiritual insight than all of the others combined. It's interesting that the next story in John chapter 12 is the triumphal entry. And at the triumphal entry, even Jesus' disciples thought, hey, this is working out better than we thought. Lord, everybody loves you. They're going to make him the king. Judas thought his plan was working. Only Mary, out of all of the people that were around Jesus, only Mary had the spiritual insight to realize that he was really going to die. And why he was really going to die. Where did that kind of insight come from? It comes from two things. It comes from sitting at his feet. It comes from pouring it all out. When you give everything you've got for the Lord, you're going to know stuff other people don't know. That's just the way it works. God rewards those who earnestly seek him, and he'll reward you. Sit at his feet, pour it all out, and you're going to have answers to your questions. You're going to have insight. Share your faith with people you care about, like Simon. Serve, like Martha. Fellowship with Jesus continually, like Lazarus. And you're going to be the man or the woman that God uses to bring others to a saving faith in him. Mary alone knew that Jesus was going to die for the sins of the world, and you only get that kind of spiritual insight by sitting at his feet and offering your bodies, as Paul says, as living sacrifices, your genuine act of worship. Well, we'll close with this. Meanwhile, a large crowd of Jews found out that Jesus was there and came not only because of him, but also to see Lazarus, whom he had raised from the dead. So the chief priests made plans to kill Lazarus as well. I mean, think about that. There's no end. I tell you all the time, sin is insane. Well, what are we going to do about Lazarus? Now people are coming in. Well, we'll kill him too. And that's exactly what they're doing. For on account of him, many of the Jews were going over to Jesus and putting their faith in him. Now, I want to close with this picture today as we prepare our hearts for communion. I think this dinner at Simon the leper's house provides some really important insight for us. I think what we have here is a picture, an intentional picture of the church. Jesus said, wherever two or more are gathered together in my name, there I am in the midst. Well, Jesus is in the middle of this party at Simon's house. The people surrounding him have one thing in common. They're worshipers. They love him, and he wants to use them. Well, the picture there and the picture here is the same. We have a whole bunch of people here today in all three services that are a bunch of former lepers. Leprosy, the type of sin. We're all sinners. And because of that, like Simon, we ought to be the most grateful people on earth because we have been rescued from the dominion of darkness and delivered into the kingdom of the Son he loves. We've been delivered from our own form of leprosy. In church, with people that worship all kinds of ways. Hopefully leaving the smell of heaven behind everywhere we go. We have Simon's taking risks and being hospitable. We have, as I said, Martha's serving and Lazarus's fellowshipping and Mary's worshiping. And because I said this is a picture of church, sadly it's also true we have people right in the middle of the church who are Judas's betraying. Men and women whose worship isn't genuine, whose worship is not sincere. And that's why I tell you so often the time is short. I want you to take a cue from Martha if that describes you. And I'm not saying you're a devil. I'm not saying that you're equal with Judas. I'm just saying that if your heart isn't sincere, if your worship isn't genuine, if you're not pouring everything out for the Lord, if you're holding things back, if there's still willful sin that's going on in your life and you think it's okay because nobody knows, I want you to know the time is short. And our story gives us a picture of that as well, because Jesus, in just 6 days, is going to die for the sins of the world. And because Judas, in just 6 days, will betray the Lord and prepare to be plunged into hell for eternity. You see, this picture is a picture of our church. So how do we close? Well, what does your worship smell like to the Lord? What does it look like? Is it a beautiful thing to him? And again, I'm not talking about the singing. The singing is great. We're so blessed by the people that the Lord has provided here. And I hope this doesn't make them uncomfortable, but next time, maybe instead of just listening, look at their faces. I keep thinking I'm going to have a rope up here to keep Judy Bush on stage. It's just so much joy. That's what real worship looks like. Think about Alana's picture. That's what real worship looks like. That's the tender heart of pure, sincere worship. But it's also hospitality. Even if people are looking for you, like Simon. Even if people won't forget your past, it's being hospitable and doing it just for Jesus. It's serving with the right heart. Not the grumbling heart. You did, but you repented. And now your heart is right and your service is a pleasing fragrance, a pleasing aroma to the Lord. That's what Martha learned, and we see in this picture. Maybe people don't see you sitting at the feet of Jesus like Lazarus fellowshipping or like Mary pouring it all out. Worship, Jesus said, has to be true worship, sincere worship, spiritual, in the Spirit worship. So how do we do it? Simple. You give him everything. You hold nothing back. You take some risks. When you're afraid, you say, Jesus, increase my faith. And you do it anyway. And it'll change your life. And just maybe when you walk by, somebody will go, he smells good. She smells good. And you can say, it's just Jesus. Would the ushers come forward and prepare the elements? Father, as we close our first service and prepare our hearts for communion, may we bring a sweet-smelling fragrance